The fire had burned itself out long before he arrived, leaving behind only the twisted skeleton of a ship and the acrid scent of charred metal that clung to the wind. Elias had seen wrecks before, on forgotten trade routes, on the desolate moons where smugglers gambled with old engines, but this one was different. It stood half buried in the sand like a corpse refusing to be swallowed by the desert, its hull warped and blackened, its once proud banners reduced to ash. He approached slowly, rifle slung but not raised, boots crunching over glassy fragments of scorched alloy. Wrecks attracted scavengers, and scavengers were often more dangerous than any wild predator, but he had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that this ship held something more than scrap. The silence was complete, oppressive, broken only by the faint whine of cooling metal. As he drew closer, he noticed signs of movement, not in the wreck itself but beside it, tucked into the shadow of a fallen wing. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, the desert haze forming shapes from smoke, but then he saw her. A figure crouched low, shielding something small with her body. She was no human. Her skin carried a pale violet sheen, patterned with faint bioluminescent streaks that flickered like embers in the gloom. Her eyes, wide and slanted, fixed on him with a mixture of terror and defiance, and in her arms was a child, smaller, trembling, its face half hidden against her chest. Elias froze. He had fought aliens before, traded with them too, and he knew enough to recognize the posture of desperation. She was no soldier. She was a survivor, a widow perhaps, clutching the only thing she had left in the galaxy. He lowered his rifle deliberately, letting the gesture carry across the distance, and spoke in a calm voice, though he knew she might not understand. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. The child whimpered, a soft, high-pitched sound, and the woman pulled it tighter to her. She shifted as though preparing to run, but where could she go? The desert stretched for leagues in every direction, a sea of ochre dunes under a cruel sun. Elias took another careful step, hands open, showing he carried no threat. His throat felt dry, not from the heat but from the sudden weight of responsibility pressing on him. He had come here searching for salvage, for something he could sell to keep his ship running another cycle, but instead he had found life, fragile, desperate, and in need of saving. And something in him, something buried beneath years of hard choices and lonely nights among the stars, refused to turn away. He remembered his own family long gone, their faces lost to war and distance, and he felt a pang sharp as a blade. Slowly he lowered himself to one knee so he wouldn't tower over her. The desert wind whipped his cloak around him, tugging at the edges, but he remained steady. "You're not safe here," he said, softer this time, though again he doubted she could parse his words. "But I can help you. If you'll let me." Her gaze never wavered, luminous eyes locked on him as though she could peel back his intentions, weigh his soul with a glance. The child stirred, peeking out, revealing features that mirrored hers but softer, rounder, the innocence of someone who had never yet known the cruelty of the galaxy. Elias felt his chest tighten. He thought of how close they must have come to death, trapped in the flames, escaping only to collapse beside the wreck with nowhere to go. Survivors, yes, but survivors clinging to the edge of despair. He reached into the pouch at his belt slowly, carefully, and drew out a ration bar. Breaking it in half, he set the pieces down on the sand between them, not advancing, simply offering. The scent of protein and dried fruit drifted upward. The woman hesitated, suspicion written across every line of her posture, but hunger was a power greater than fear. The child squirmed, reaching out, and she whispered something in a language Elias could not understand. Her voice was soft, melodic even through exhaustion, and after a long pause she extended one trembling hand to snatch the food. She pressed it to the child first, letting the small fingers grasp it, watching as the little one nibbled with hesitant relief. Only then did she taste the second piece herself, eyes never leaving Elias. It was a beginning, not trust, not yet, but the first crack in the wall between them. Elias exhaled slowly, not realizing until then how long he had been holding his breath. He could have walked away. He could have told himself it wasn't his problem, that helping them would only draw trouble, that the desert claimed lives every day and two more wouldn't matter. But he knew the truth. If he left them, their bones would soon join the wreckage, another nameless tragedy swallowed by the sands. And he also knew he could not live with that choice. Standing again, he gestured toward the horizon, where his own ship waited beyond a ridge of dunes. "Come with me," he said. The words were simple, but his tone carried the weight of a vow. The woman clutched her child tighter, her face torn between fear and the faintest flicker of hope. The desert wind shifted, carrying away the last lingering smoke of the wreck, and in that moment Elias felt as though the galaxy itself was watching, waiting to see what path would be chosen. The first steps away from the wreck were the hardest. Elias kept his pace slow, careful not to spook them, while the woman lingered in the shadow of the ruined ship as though leaving it meant abandoning the last trace of her past. The child's hand tugged gently at her arm, eyes darting between Elias and the empty desert. She murmured something to the little one, her voice raw with fatigue, and then, with a shudder that seemed to cost her more than he could measure, she rose to follow. Elias glanced back, catching the image of her silhouette framed against the smoldering carcass of the vessel, and he realized that whatever dreams or memories had once lived inside that ship were gone forever. What remained was only her and the child, tethered now to him by circumstance and choice. The desert welcomed no travelers, and yet they pressed on. Heat radiated from the sand, waves of shimmering air bending the horizon. Elias offered water from his canteen, holding it out and stepping back so she could take it without feeling cornered. She hesitated, then accepted, guiding the spout to the child's lips first, letting every drop count before she drank herself. Her hands shook, not with fear now but with weakness. He noticed the way she cradled her side, as though hiding an injury beneath the folds of scorched fabric. Blood, faint but dark, had dried along the edge. He said nothing, only adjusted his pace to keep her steady, silently calculating how long before exhaustion forced them down. By the time they reached the ridge, the suns had dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the dunes. His ship waited there, a weathered freighter that had seen better years, its hull patched and repatched, its engines temperamental at best. To Elias it was home, the only constant in a life spent wandering. To them he hoped it would be salvation. He keyed the ramp open, the hiss of hydraulics breaking the silence, and gestured for them to enter. The woman hesitated at the threshold, scanning the ship's darkened interior as though expecting a trap. The child tugged at her again, small fingers insistent, and at last she stepped inside. Her movements cautious but resolute. Elias followed, sealing the ramp behind them, shutting out the vast desert and the lingering ghost of the wreck. The air inside was cooler, carrying the faint scent of oil and metal, the smell of a ship that had traveled far. He led them to the small galley, setting down another ration pack, then crouched to meet the child's curious gaze. Up close, he could see the differences more clearly, the faint glow of veins beneath translucent skin, the slightly elongated shape of the eyes, the delicate crest of cartilage at the temples. They were beautiful in a fragile, otherworldly way, and something in Elias ached at the thought of how easily such lives could be erased. The child reached out a hand, tentative, brushing the edge of his sleeve. Elias smiled faintly. "Name?" he said slowly, pointing to himself. "Elias." He repeated it, pressing his palm to his chest. Then he gestured toward the woman, raising his brows in question. She studied him warily before answering with a single word, soft but clear. It sounded like Sarah, though her accent lent it a lilting tone unlike any human speech. He nodded gently. "Sarah." Then he gestured toward the child. She stroked the small head, whispering, and Elias caught the name, Talon. He repeated it, earning a curious blink from the child, who then gave the faintest smile. In that moment something shifted between them. They were no longer strangers by circumstance but people who had exchanged names, and names carried meaning, a bridge across the chasm of fear. Later, as the ship hummed with life and the engines began their warming cycle, Elias patched Sarah's wound. She resisted at first, pulling away with sharp words he could not understand, but when the pain forced her still, she allowed it. He worked gently, cleaning the burn and binding it with practiced hands, murmuring reassurance though she could not grasp the language. Her eyes, sharp with suspicion, softened just slightly as she realized he was not hurting her. He saw exhaustion drag her features down, the weight of grief pressing heavy, but she held herself upright, perhaps for Talon's sake. When the treatment was done, she whispered something he couldn't parse, her tone low, almost grateful. He didn't need to understand the words. The intent was enough. As the freighter lifted from the dunes, the desert shrinking beneath them, Elias stole one last glance at the wreck through the viewport. Flames had long since died, leaving only broken bones of metal scattered across endless sand. He knew someone else might come, scavengers, raiders, but by then there would be nothing left worth taking. Nothing except the memory of a woman and child who had refused to die there. He turned from the sight and focused on the stars ahead. The galaxy was wide, cruel in its indifference, but in that moment Elias carried something more important than cargo or profit. He carried lives that had been entrusted to him, and whether by chance or destiny, that made him responsible. He guided the ship into the sky, engines roaring as they cut through the atmosphere, and in the quiet of the cabin he felt the beginning of something he hadn't known in years. A sense of belonging, fragile yet real, born beside the wreck of a burned ship and carried now among the stars. Space unfolded beyond the viewport, a vast canvas of black speckled with distant stars. Elias had always loved this sight, the silence of the void, the endless promise of destinations unknown, but tonight it carried a different weight. He was no longer alone. Behind him, in the modest crew quarters, Sarah sat with Talon curled against her, both weary from the desert ordeal. Their presence filled the freighter with a warmth it had never known, a contrast to the years of solitude he had endured. Yet along with that warmth came a heavy responsibility pressing against his chest. He was a trader, a wanderer, not a guardian. He had no blueprint for raising a child or guiding a woman whose entire world had just burned. And yet, as the stars slid by, he knew he had chosen this path the moment he stepped toward her at the wreck. Some choices made themselves, and this was one of them. The hum of the engines soothed him, though Sarah flinched at each vibration, her senses tuned differently, unaccustomed to human machinery. Talon, on the other hand, showed curiosity. The child reached out to touch the panels, small fingers tracing the glowing indicators with wide-eyed wonder. Elias chuckled softly, lifting the little one onto his knee and showing how to press a harmless button that made the console chirp. Talon's laugh was bright and pure, a sound Elias hadn't heard in so long that it startled him. He caught Sarah watching, her expression unreadable, torn between suspicion and something softer, maybe relief. She said nothing, but her eyes lingered on him a moment longer before she looked away. That glance told Elias more than words could. She was beginning to see that his intent wasn't harm, though trust was still a distant shore. As the ship coasted on autopilot, Elias began to piece together fragments of their story. The wreckage had borne markings from a distant colony fleet, one he had heard rumors of but never visited. They had been traders, perhaps, or refugees fleeing conflict. Whatever the reason, raiders must have descended, torching the vessel and leaving no survivors but the two he now sheltered. He asked questions gently, pointing to symbols on his data pad, drawing crude sketches, hoping she might answer. At first she resisted, her words flowing like water over stone, incomprehensible yet filled with emotion. But over time patterns emerged. He learned that her mate had died in the fire. Her gestures mimed an explosion, her voice catching on the memory, and Talon pressed closer to her side. Elias didn't push further. Some wounds needed no translation. All he knew was that the title he had given her in his mind, widow, was true, and it explained the haunted strength in her eyes. Nights aboard the freighter blurred into a new rhythm. Elias would cook simple meals, rationing supplies with care, and watch as Sarah hesitantly tasted them before offering them to Talon. She began to mimic some of his words, repeating them under her breath, her accent heavy but improving with each attempt. "Water," she said one evening, holding the cup with trembling pride as if conquering a small mountain. Elias nodded encouragement, his heart swelling at the progress. Talon, quick to adapt, learned even faster, parroting words with childlike eagerness. Soon the cabin echoed with their shared voices, a patchwork language forming between them. Laughter, once foreign to the steel corridors, now threaded through the silence, changing the ship into something more than metal and bolts. It became a home. Still, Elias knew danger loomed. The galaxy was not forgiving, and news of a burned ship might spread, drawing scavengers or authorities asking questions he could not answer. He adjusted their course toward a neutral station where he could refuel and gather information, but a knot of unease sat in his gut. Sarah seemed to sense it too. One night, as Talon slept wrapped in a blanket, she approached him at the cockpit, her presence silent until he turned and found her standing there. She touched her chest, then gestured to him, her eyes searching. He didn't understand the words she spoke, but he caught the tone, fear mingled with a plea. She was asking if he would abandon them, if this kindness was temporary. Elias shook his head firmly. "No," he said, pressing a hand to his chest as she had done. "Family." The word felt strange on his tongue after so many years alone, but it fit. Her lips parted as though she didn't quite grasp it, but she seemed to feel its meaning. Her eyes glistened in the dim light, and for the first time she didn't look away. When they reached the station, Elias was cautious. He cloaked Sarah and Talon in heavy hoods, hiding the glow of their skin, and guided them through the bustling corridors. Traders shouted deals, engines roared, and the smell of oil mixed with spices from a dozen worlds. Talon clung to his hand, the small grip grounding Elias more than he expected. He bartered quickly for fuel and supplies, careful not to linger, but even so he caught curious stares. Word of survivors from the burned ship might already have spread. They had to move on before questions turned dangerous. Back aboard the freighter, Sarah seemed relieved when the station fell away behind them, stars swallowing its glow. She whispered something over Talon's head, a lullaby perhaps, her voice carrying both grief and hope. Elias listened quietly, the melody seeping into him like a promise. Days stretched into weeks and the fragile bond between them deepened. Elias taught Talon how to secure straps in zero gravity, laughing as the child floated with arms outstretched like a bird. Sarah watched, her posture slowly easing, though sorrow still shadowed her gaze when she thought he wasn't looking. Elias never pressed, never demanded more than she could give, but he was there, steady as the ship's engines, a constant presence when everything else had been torn from her. In turn, she began to trust him with small gestures, a shared smile when Talon laughed, a quiet nod of thanks when he fixed a broken clasp on her garment. Each moment was a stone laid in the foundation of something unspoken yet real. Elias had lived his life believing he was a drifter, a man untethered to anything but the next job. Yet now, as he stood at the viewport watching stars streak by, Talon asleep against his shoulder and Sarah dozing nearby, he felt the shape of a different future forming. It was fragile, yes, and fraught with dangers, but it was real. They were no longer strangers linked by chance. They were something more, forged in fire and carried through the void together. And though he couldn't name it fully yet, he knew with certainty that whatever lay ahead, he would not let them be lost again. The quiet that followed their departure from the station was deceptive, a fragile piece stretched thin across the void. Elias knew better than to trust it. He had lived long enough among the fringes of civilization to understand that every station, every dock, every whispered rumor left a trail. And the wreck they had fled from, the ship that had burned into the sands, would not be forgotten quickly. Raiders had caused it, of that he was certain, and raiders rarely left unfinished business. Still he kept these fears to himself. Sarah carried enough weight on her shoulders without his paranoia crushing her further. Instead he focused on small things, teaching Talon new words, repairing the freighter's stubborn systems, keeping the rhythms of life steady so they could all breathe easier. Talon thrived under the attention, laughter echoing through the narrow corridors as though the child had decided the freighter was a playground. Elias found himself smiling more often, caught off guard by how quickly joy could return in the presence of innocence. For Sarah the changes were slower. She watched, measured, guarded, but each day her walls eroded a little more like stone worn by water. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, Elias caught her gaze lingering on him not with suspicion but with quiet gratitude. It was during one of those quiet stretches, when Talon was asleep and the ship hummed on autopilot, that Elias noticed Sarah approach the cockpit. She moved hesitantly, still unused to sharing space with him, but her eyes carried determination. She gestured toward the controls, then to herself and spoke a string of words he didn't know. Still he understood her intent. She wanted to learn, to understand the vessel that had become their refuge. Elias slid aside, motioning for her to sit. She studied the panels intently, absorbing every gesture as he explained, slowly with words, with demonstrations, how the ship breathed and moved. Her hands, delicate yet steady, mimicked his motions across the console. He realized then that she was not just surviving for Talon's sake but planning, ensuring she could take control if fate ever tore him away. The thought tightened something in his chest, but he admired her resolve. She was no fragile remnant of tragedy. She was a survivor, adapting, refusing to be powerless. Their fragile rhythm broke 2 weeks later when the first shadow appeared on the scanners. At first Elias dismissed it as a freighter cutting across a trade lane, but as hours passed, the vessel lingered, keeping pace at a distance that felt too deliberate to ignore. His instincts sharpened. He said nothing to Talon, but he adjusted their course subtly, trying to shake the tail. The shadow remained. Sarah noticed his unease. She touched his arm, her eyes questioning, and though she didn't understand his words, she read enough in his expression. He didn't hide it. He pointed at the blip on the scanner, then pressed a finger to his lips, signaling silence. Her face paled and she pulled Talon closer, the protective edge in her posture returning like armor reforged. By the third day the pursuit grew bolder. The shadow drew nearer, and when Elias pushed the engines into a higher burn, the other ship matched speed. Raiders. Had to be. He cursed under his breath, hands flying over the controls, coaxing every ounce of power from his weary engines. The freighter groaned, shuddering under the strain, but it obeyed. Sarah braced herself against the wall, clutching Talon tightly, whispering to him in a low voice to keep him calm. Elias felt anger surge through him. Anger at the raiders who had already taken everything from them, anger at the thought of losing what fragile family they had built. "Not again," he muttered, jaw clenched as he plotted a desperate course through an asteroid field ahead. It was a risk, but it was the only way to break pursuit. The chase was brutal. Rocks the size of cities loomed around them, spinning slowly in the darkness. Elias wove the freighter between them, hands steady, sweat slicking his brow. The pursuing ship followed, weapons flashing as streaks of plasma lit the void. Shields flared weakly under the assault, barely holding. Talon cried out at the noise, burying his face against Sarah's chest. Elias felt every blast as if it struck his own body. He pushed harder, banking the ship into a narrow gap, scraping metal along stone but breaking the enemy's line of sight. 4 hours they played this deadly game, weaving through the labyrinth of rock and shadow until at last silence returned. The scanners cleared. The shadow was gone. Elias sagged back in his chair, chest heaving, hands trembling from the intensity. They had survived, but only barely. When he turned, Sarah was watching him, her eyes wide with something more than fear. She whispered his name, or something close to it, her voice trembling with relief. Then she reached across the console, placing her hand briefly over his. It was the first time she had touched him willingly, not out of necessity or fear but as a gesture of trust, of connection. The warmth of it lingered. Long after she pulled back, retreating to comfort Talon. Elias sat there in the dim cockpit, the hum of engines steadying his pulse, and realized how deeply intertwined their lives had become. He was no longer protecting them out of obligation. He was protecting them because without them he no longer knew who he was. That night, as Talon slept and Sarah hummed a soft lullaby, Elias lay awake in his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. The stars beyond held countless dangers, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that outweighed the fear. He had become their shield, their anchor, and though the galaxy would not relent, he would not falter. Family wasn't something he had expected to find in the ruins of a burned ship. Yet here they were, 3 souls bound together not by blood but by survival, by choice, by the unspoken vow that they would face whatever came next as one. And Elias, hardened wanderer that he was, found himself believing that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something worth fighting for until the very end. Days after the chase through the asteroid field, silence returned to the freighter, but it was not the same silence as before. There was tension woven into it now, a heightened awareness that danger lingered in the void like a predator in the dark. Elias spent long hours at the console, recalibrating the engines, scanning for signs of pursuit, his body wound tight like a wire. Sarah sensed it too. She kept Talon close, her posture protective, her eyes flicking often to the viewport as though expecting another shadow to rise from the stars. Yet in the midst of that tension, something else had changed between them. The touch she had given him at the console during the chase was small, fleeting, but it had been real, and it lingered in his mind like a brand. He found himself watching her more closely, noticing details he had ignored before, the way her voice softened when she soothed Talon, the quiet strength in her hands as she helped secure supplies, the faint glow of her skin in the dim light of the ship. He tried to push the thoughts aside, but they grew stronger each day, pulling at him in ways he had not expected. It was Talon who bridged the gap more than anyone. The child had begun to cling to Elias as much as to Sarah, his laughter echoing through the narrow halls, his small hands tugging eagerly at Elias's sleeve whenever he passed. Elias showed him how to press harmless buttons on the console, how to buckle into a crash seat, how to open a ration pack. Each time, Sarah watched, and though her gaze remained guarded, there was no longer the edge of suspicion that had once lived there. Instead, there was something else, hesitation, perhaps even the beginnings of trust. One evening, as Talon sat curled between them, Elias handed the child a simple carved trinket he had kept from a distant world, a piece of bone shaped into a star. Talon's eyes lit up, clutching it with delight, and Sarah whispered a word in her language, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Elias didn't understand the word, but he understood its meaning, gratitude. Trust, however, was fragile, and Elias knew it could be shattered in an instant. That truth came back to him one night when alarms blared across the ship. Not raiders this time, but proximity warnings, an anomaly pulling them off course. The freighter bucked, shuddering as gravitational currents seized it, dragging them toward a rogue moon hidden in the dust belt of a forgotten system. Elias cursed under his breath, fighting the controls, but the old ship had limits and they were caught. The crash, when it came, was violent. Metal screamed, sparks flared, and the freighter skidded across the moon's barren surface before slamming to a halt. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of failing systems. Elias shook off the haze, his body aching, and scrambled toward Sarah and Talon. They were alive, shaken but unharmed. Relief hit him like a wave, but it was short-lived. The ship was damaged badly, engines offline, hull fractured, systems bleeding power. Stranded, they had no choice but to adapt. The moon was harsh but not lifeless. Jagged cliffs ringed valleys of dust and rock, and faint traces of atmosphere allowed them to venture outside with respirators. Elias scavenged what he could from the wreck, setting up a makeshift shelter beside the freighter. Sarah surprised him then. Where he expected despair, she showed resilience. She gathered supplies, tended to Talon, and even aided him in repairing panels with hands that learned quickly. Together they worked in silence at first, then in halting words, building a fragile rhythm that felt almost like partnership. Nights were the hardest, when cold seeped into the ground and Talon whimpered in his sleep. Sarah would cradle him close, singing softly in her language, her voice carrying through the shelter like a fragile flame against the dark. Elias listened, pretending to sleep, the sound pulling at something deep within him. He realized that even here, stranded and uncertain, he felt less alone than he had in years. Repairs stretched into weeks. Each day they scavenged, each night they endured the cold together. Talon grew accustomed to playing among the rocks, chasing small glowing insects that flitted between cracks. Elias caught himself laughing at the child's antics, his heart lighter in moments than he thought possible. Sarah began to open more during these days. She asked about the stars, pointing at the sky, repeating his words in broken English. He, in turn, tried to learn hers, mimicking sounds until she laughed at his clumsy attempts. That laughter, rare and soft, struck him harder than any battle had ever done. It was a sound of life reborn from ashes. Slowly, he realized what had been forming between them all along. They were not simply survivors bound by circumstance. They were becoming a family, unspoken yet undeniable. The breakthrough came one night when a storm swept across the moon. Winds howled, battering the shelter, tearing at the edges of their fragile refuge. The power flickered, plunging them into darkness. Talon cried, terrified, and Elias instinctively pulled the child into his arms, holding him close, murmuring reassurances. Sarah sat beside him, her face drawn with worry, but when she saw Talon's small hands clutch Elias's shirt, she hesitated only a moment before leaning closer, resting against him as the storm raged outside. The three of them huddled together, warmth shared against the cold. In that moment, words were unnecessary. Elias felt it in his bones. He belonged here with them as much as they belonged with him. The storm eventually passed, but something deeper had settled in its wake. A bond, unspoken, unbreakable. When at last the freighter's engines roared back to life weeks later, patched and groaning but functional, Elias stood at the controls with Sarah and Talon beside him. Together they watched the barren moon fall away, shrinking into the void. They had survived desert wrecks, raiders, and storms, but more importantly, they had built something between them that no fire or storm could erase. As the stars stretched ahead once more, Elias no longer saw himself as a solitary wanderer. He saw himself as part of something larger, something fragile and fierce, a family forged in fire, bound not by blood but by choice. And for the first time in a long, lonely life, he felt a certainty that whatever awaited them in the endless night of space, they would face it together. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt strange yet comforting to Elias, a rhythm of blending lives across species, of building a fragile peace where once there had been only fire and ruin. The wreck of the alien vessel stood like a silent monument behind the ridge, half consumed by ash, a reminder of what had been lost. But Elias refused to let that image become their destiny. He woke early each morning, rising before the twin suns had fully risen, and worked on expanding the shelter into something sturdier, with walls reinforced by salvaged panels from the ship and a roof patched together from tarp and hull fragments. Amara, though still grieving, surprised him with her resilience. She helped in ways she could, guiding him to alien materials he might have overlooked, explaining how some crystalline shards from the wreck could conduct energy if aligned properly, and teaching Leora to carry small tools to hand to Elias while he worked. There was a strange joy in those little moments, when the widow and her child laughed softly at his clumsy mistakes, their voices breaking the heaviness that lingered over them. He noticed too how their bond deepened, how the child leaned on her mother with unwavering trust, and how Amara found courage in her daughter's innocence. It was a fragile sanctuary, one Elias guarded fiercely. Yet life on the barren world was never truly safe. The plains stretched endlessly around them, and though they had learned the terrain, predators prowled the distant hills. On one evening, as shadows grew long, a low rumble carried across the wind, and Elias instinctively reached for the battered rifle he kept close. Amara pulled Leora close, her dark eyes narrowing, and whispered words in her tongue, words that sounded like both prayer and warning. A shape moved beyond the rocks, large, scaled, with eyes that glowed faintly in the twilight. Elias raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Amara touched his arm, her grip firm. She spoke quickly, urging him to wait. Then she stepped forward, her voice rising in a strange, melodic tone, the sound carrying into the dusk like a song woven from sorrow. The creature stilled, head tilting as if recognizing the melody. Elias held his breath, every muscle tense. Slowly, impossibly, the beast backed away, its luminous gaze lingering before it vanished into the dark. When Amara returned to his side, her hands trembled, but her face was calm. She explained that the song was one of her people's oldest traditions, a chant to honor hunters of the wild. Even the beasts of this world seemed to understand it. Elias looked at her in awe then, realizing that survival wasn't only about weapons or walls, but about heritage and memory, about carrying voices from the past into the present. That night, after Leora had fallen asleep curled in the corner of the shelter, Elias and Amara sat near the faint glow of the fire, their faces half lit by flickering embers. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Amara broke it, her voice soft yet steady. She told him of her husband, how he had been a navigator, proud and kind, and how he had died when the raiders struck their ship. Her words trembled at first, but as she spoke, they grew stronger, as if sharing the memory anchored her grief. Elias listened, every word sinking deep, and when she faltered, he offered no empty comfort, only the quiet assurance of his presence. In return he told her of Earth, not just its beauty but its scars too. He described oceans that stretched beyond sight, forests older than any city, and skies that sometimes wept rain instead of fire. He confessed that he had once fled those skies, seeking fortune among the stars, but had found only emptiness. Until now, he added quietly, surprising himself with the honesty of it. Amara's gaze met his then, and in her eyes he saw not just sorrow but resilience, a flame that refused to die. In that moment, the silence between them shifted, no longer heavy but alive, filled with something unnamed yet undeniable. The following days carried a subtle change. Elias found himself watching Amara differently, not as the fragile survivor he had once carried from the wreck, but as a woman who carried strength beneath her grief. She moved with quiet grace, her every action deliberate, and he began to notice the way the sunlight caught in her hair, or how her laughter, rare but genuine, seemed to fill the air with warmth. Leora, too, blossomed under this fragile new life. She learned to speak fragments of Elias's language, her small voice stumbling through words like home and safe, and each attempt tugged at Elias's heart. They began to share meals more openly, combining what little rations remained with foraged roots Amara recognized, turning necessity into ritual. At night, Elias sometimes woke to find Leora sleeping against his side, her small hand gripping his sleeve, as if anchoring herself to the promise that he would still be there when dawn came. And in those moments he felt a responsibility heavier than any duty he had known before. He was no longer just a wanderer, but something closer to a guardian, perhaps even a father in a sense he had never dared imagine. But peace remained fragile. One morning, while scouting near the ridge, Elias discovered tracks too sharp and deliberate to belong to wild beasts. Boot prints, human or near enough, pressed deep into the dust. His heart tightened. Raiders or scavengers, they were not alone anymore. He returned swiftly, concealing his fear as he warned Amara. She understood instantly, her face pale but her resolve unwavering. They began preparing, reinforcing their shelter further, hiding supplies, and teaching Leora to stay silent when danger approached. Elias knew conflict was inevitable, and the thought of losing what they had built gnawed at him. Yet when he looked at Amara, standing tall despite the weight of loss, he felt something surge inside him, a determination fiercer than fear. He would not let harm reach them, not while he drew breath. For the first time in years, his life was no longer about survival for himself, but about protecting a family that fate had thrust upon him. And though the horizon threatened with shadow, he found courage in the knowledge that together, they had already transformed ashes into hope. The discovery of the boot prints haunted Elias through the following days, a silent threat pressing against his mind as heavily as the heat of the twin suns. Every time the wind carried a sound too sharp or a shadow lingered too long, he tightened his grip on the old rifle and scanned the horizon with narrowed eyes. Amara noticed his unease, and though she said little, her movements grew more cautious, her voice softer, her attention constantly flickering to Leora. The child seemed to sense it too, her laughter less frequent, her wide eyes filled with questions she didn't yet know how to ask. Elias hated the way fear invaded their fragile peace, but he couldn't deny it. Others were near and others rarely brought kindness. He had lived too long among the broken edges of the galaxy to believe in chance meetings. If scavengers had found the wreck, they would not leave without stripping it bare, and if they saw Amara and Leora, mercy would not guide their hands. That thought alone carved into him like a blade, sharper than his own fears, for he could endure danger but not the idea of seeing harm touch them.